Today's daf is daf Lamed Dal, and we begin with Tnan Hossam. The Gemara is trying to analyze the issue of what's called the Isur of Lelaben Rafim. Rafim are shingles that they used to use after they heated them up as a method of roasting. They would roast things on a hot tile, and we cannot heat up that tile on Yontif. And the Gemara had offered two possible reasons for the Isur. One is because we're dealing with new Rafim that have never been used before, and there's always a possibility that as a result of heating them, they will crack from the heat, and thus the malach that he did of heating them up was not for ochel nefesh, because he won't be able to use them for the express purpose of roasting. The other possibility is because when you're dealing with rafim chadashim, brand new shingles that have never been used before, you need a heating process in order to strengthen and make it into a kli, and we don't make a new kli on Yontif. The Gemara says, Tnan Hasim, we have a Mishnah in Masechet Chulin, and this is on Daf Nun Vav in Masechet Chulin, and this is a Mishnah that addresses the issue of trephos. Trephos are injuries to a bird or an animal that make it trefa and make it impossible, according to the halacha, to shech the animal that has this major injury in a vital organ and be machshirit la'achila. And there are various circumstantial evidences that might indicate that the animal is a trefa. For example, drasa. Let's say a person steps on top of a bird, and he may have injured it in a very dangerous way. O tarafa b'kosel. Or let's say the animal got thrown up against the wall. O sheritzatsta behema. Or an animal knocked it down, and umefarcheses. Mefarcheses means the animal is still jumping around, it's still fluttering. In all these three circumstances that were described, we're afraid of what's called risuk evarim, that perhaps the internal organs of, in this case, the bird, were injured in a very radical way. Now, we have to check out this animal and decide whether it's a trefa or not. In modern technology, there may be other ways of seeing the inside of the animal. Now, he's going to shech the bird. Well, if he shechts it immediately after any one of those three occurrences happen, then we really have to check out the bird posthumously very carefully to see if it's a trefa. But shasa, be'esli es ushchata, if 24 hours since the Maisa happened, he shechted the animal, which means that the bird lived for a full 24 hours, then kshera. Because the assumption is that if the animal would have had what we call risuk evarim, its inner organs would have been destroyed in such a way that the trefa wouldn't have lasted a full 24 hours. Even if the animal lived for a full day and then we shechted it, it's not automatically and immediately determined to be kosher, but sricha b'dika. We still have to check out, after the shechita, the inner organs of the bird to make sure, to guarantee that it's not a trefa and there was no risuk evarim. In other words, we're still very suspicious about this bird, that perhaps its rove, most of its bones, let's say, for example, the vertebrae or the ribs, if you want to call it, or the shidra, the the spinal cord of the bird was ripped, and if that be the case, the animal is a treifa. So therefore, we have to check out after shchita and do this bedika. Boy minei Rabbi Yirmiyah me Rav Zera ma'ul l'shachata b'yontif. After this bird had experienced this catastrophic event, and now we're afraid that maybe there was Risa Tevarim and the animal's a treifa, which would mean that the shchita could not possibly be matir this animal because it's a treifa. So on Yontif, based on the chashash that maybe perhaps there's Risa Tevarim, we should perhaps prohibit the shchita. Why? Because mimachzekin and reusa b'yontif. As far as the law of yontif is concerned, do we have a cheskas reusa? Just like we said in the Mishnah in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Antignos, that after the animal had this terrible incident, we have to check it out posthumously. We're not absolutely sure whether its status is that of a kosher or a treifa. In that light, maybe on yontif, we should be machmir. The Torah allowed us to shech the bird on yontif for the purpose of eating, but it may turn out, unfortunately, that we won't be able to eat this bird because we're going to find out and determine that it's a treifa. Amalei Reb Zera responds to Reb Yirmiyah's inquiry, and he says, Tanina, let's derive it from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, Ein melabdim es harafim litzos bahem. We're not allowed to heat up a tile in order to use it for roasting food on Yontif. But we asked, my Kovid, what is the problem with heating up this tile? And the answer is, Amar Rabba Babrachanam Rab Yochanan Hacha Berafim Chadashim Askinam if they should start with Bodkam. We're dealing with a tile that's new, has never been tested out. We may find out that after we heat it up, it's going to crack as a result of the intense heat, and thus the malach that we got involved in heating it up would have been for naught. It would not be for ochel nefesh because we can't use this tile after it's broken for tzli, for roasting. So if we can take this one step further by analogy, just like in the case of libun rafim, we prohibit it because maybe the raf will crack under heat. So too, we should prohibit by analogy shechting a bird that had this terrible fall on the chash that maybe it'll turn out to be a treifa, and then the meleches shchita was for naught, and it didn't amount to an ochel nefesh situation. I was thinking, why shouldn't we prohibit shchita on Yom Tov? Maybe the shchita will turn out to be an improper shchita. Maybe there are 5 categories of psulei shchita, and not only that, maybe the animal will turn out to be a treifa. Apparently, as a general rule, when it comes to shchita, there's no such thing as a reusa. We don't assume that maybe he won't do a proper shchita. In fact, the shochet is allowed to make a bracha. And we have a principle that you don't make a bracha in a suffix. It's no suffix. There's no reusa. So with regard to shchita, we're going to assume that he'll do a proper shchita. But something like treifa that's out of his hands, there's nothing that he can do to control whether the animal, the bird, is a treifa or not. Similar, we have a Rosh in Masechet Ksubas who asks, how do you make a bracha on Tekiah shofar? Maybe the Tokeah won't be able to blow the shofar properly. But apparently we assume that he'll study up very well before Rosh Hashanah and he'll be able to blow the shofar. And now Rabbi Yirmiyah responds to Reb Zera, says, you know what? I'm going to deflect your analogy. Amalei, Rabbi Yirmiyah says to Reb Zera, Ana, the way I understood it, the reason that libun rafim, new tiles, to heat them up for the first time on Yom Tov is prohibited, is because of asiyas kli. You're making it into a new vessel until the point that you heat it up. It's not functional. And the Isser of heating up tiles on Yom Tov has nothing to do with the fear that maybe the tile will disintegrate, it'll crack due to the heat. And therefore, the entire malacha here that prohibits Libu and Rafim is Makav Patish, and that has no relationship to our issue about whether you're allowed to shecht an animal that has a reisa on Yom Tov. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa. Now we're talking about a situation on Shabbos where an entire group of people, one after the other, contribute to the violation of Shabbos. Who's going to be chayav? All of them, one of them, the first one, the last one. Echad mevi'es ha'or. One person brought the fire for the purpose of cooking a pot of food on the fire. And let's say, for example, he may have brought coals for the purpose of burning the coals and creating a fire. Echad mevi'es ha'etzim. Another person brought the fuel for the fire. Echad shofei says hakidera. One person put an empty pot on the fire. Echad mevi'es hamayim. Another person poured water into the pot. Echad nosim b'tocho tavlin. Another person put a spice into this tavlin. Echad megis. Another person mixed around the contents of the pot. In other words, the malacha of bishul and havara in this case is a composite of many different activities, many different segments and actions, all of which, when integrated to a whole, create a malacha of havara, a malacha of bishul. So, for example, let's go back to the first fellow on this list. He brought the gachelas, he brought the coals. Well, what's going to happen is that as he brings the coals, the wind is going to blow the coals and it's going to create a fire. Somebody brought eitzim, he brought the wood. When he brings the wood and puts it into the fire, it's going to automatically burn. So he's chayav for meleches havara. Somebody puts a kedera, a pot of on top of the eish, then we'll have to see exactly later on. The Gemara is going to clarify what his isur, what his violation is. The person who poured in the water or the food or the spices, certainly he's doing an act of bishul. And megis, which means stirring a pot on a fire, is always considered a meleches bishul. So the Gemara immediately asks a contradiction. Vasanya, we learned in a different brisa, ha'achron chayav v'kulam p'turim. Only the last one who put the pot with food on the fire or added the food into the empty pot, he's the one who is chayav, and all the others are p'turim. And the Gemara says, Lokash, I can reconcile this apparent contradiction. The brisa that we quoted earlier, that all of them are chayav, that's a case of the Isi Ur Me'ikara. The first one brought the fire, and therefore the fire is already there. Everyone who came subsequently is adding to the fire, whether he brings the fuel, he the eitzim, or he puts the pot on the fire. The fire was already there. But the brisa that says that only the achron is fire, that's the Isi Ur Basof. The last one on the list who came forward was the one who lit the fire. And everybody else had already brought what they had to bring, whether it was the pot, whether it is the fuel and the food for the pot. And the last fellow on this list was the one who lit the fire. And therefore, without the fire, nothing has happened over here. There's no bishul. He's chayav and the other are potter. So Gemara asks, Bishlei Makulu Kavid Meiser. I understand that the first brisa says they're all chayav because each one of them did a meiser, and that meiser constituted a violation of the Isur Malach on Shabbos, which is a doraisa like Mavir or Mavashim. But Ella Shofei says Hakidera, a person puts an empty pot on a fire. What's that? What malacha is he guilty of? My covet. The reason he's chayav is not for the same reason or anything similar to the others on the list, but by putting an empty pot on the fire, if it's a kedera chadash, it's never been used before, then he's going to be chayav for meleches tikun mana, meaning to be metakin a kli. Mishum libun rafim naguba. It's like the case of new tiles that have never been used, and you heat them up in order to make it into a vessel that you can use for roasting. Here too, in the case of putting a kedera chadasha on a fire, if the kedera is absolutely new, it doesn't function well until you heat it up for the first time, and that makes it into a strong, durable kli, and that's called tikkun kli, and he's chayav from makav v'patish. We learned in the Beitza. This is more about what you're allowed to do with small ovens that are brand new on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, either a larger oven or a smaller oven that have never been used. In other words, even though at this point when they're very new, they're quite not flexible, what's the word I want to use? They're quite flimsy, they're not durable, and they're not strong. For example, you would not put a pile of books on top of a brand new oven that's never been used. It might crack. However, it's kechol kaleb. What does kol kaleb mean? Kol kaleb means you have a vessel with an empty space inside, and you put something inside. It's a receptacle. Here too, a small oven, although it's quite vulnerable, but nevertheless you can store things inside of it. It's not worse than any kind of a receptacle. But you're not allowed to smoothen out the outside of this brand new oven by shining it up with oil. Being toshin, osan b'matlis, you don't take a cloth and rub it and smoothen it out before you're going to heat it up in a burning furnace. And if it has the heat because it's been used, and after you use the oven and it's burning hot, what they used to do was, in order to strengthen the vessel, in this case the small oven, they did what's called siruf. Siruf means you dunk it into cold water while it's burning hot. And that strengthens the kli. All the above are prohibited on Yom Tov because of tikkun kli. The im b'shvil lefos, but let's say it's Yom Tov, and he has a brand new oven. So on Erev Yom Tov, he should heat it up in order to strengthen the oven. And let's say he went ahead and he did that. So far he's doing everything according to the law. He has heated up the oven on Erev Yom Tov, and it's very, very hot. Now he wants to bake something in this oven, but because of the intense heat of the oven, there's a suspicion that perhaps the bread that he puts into this hot oven will burn. And therefore, what he's allowed to do is, he's allowed to cool it off by pouring cold water, and then he can use it for afiyah. In this case, we're not afraid that he's using a massive amount of water such that it would cause siruf, meaning mitzaref means to strengthen the oven, and therefore you'd be in violation of makav v'patish. We learned in the Beitza, molgim. Okay, let's see if we can figure out what molgim means. Molgim is soaking in water, but not soaking in regular water, but rather soaking something in boiling hot water is called molgim. Now you have an animal that was shechted, and you want to remove the seir, the hairs, and especially from the rush and the raglayim. There are hairs on the head of the animal that was shechted and on its legs. As a result of soaking the animal in hot water, boiling hot water, you can remove the hairs. And you're allowed to do this on Yom Tov. Now, let's say you don't have the option of soaking it in boiling hot water, then mehavivin osan bi'ur. You're allowed to take a kind of a brenner, a fire, and attach the fire, direct the fire to the outside of the rush and the raglayim in order to remove the seir, to scorch the hairs. Aval ein toflin osan becharsis. Okay, let's talk about charsis. Charsis is a result, it's a kind of a concrete that's made when you take a piece of pottery, of earthenware, and you crush it. And then you add water and you mix the water with this crushed pottery, earthenware, it's like crushed earth. And you create something which is called a charsis. And I believe the word charsis comes from the word cheres. Cheres means pottery. Now, what they used to do was, in order to smoothen out the outer skin of the animal after it was shechted, they did what's called mericha v'charsis. They would take this kind of a clay substance and smear it onto the animal's body, and as a result, they would remove the hairs. And this is prohibited on Yom Tov. V'lo ba'adam, and you can't do it with various types of earth, v'lo b'sid, or plaster. Plaster is basically, they burn a certain kind of a stone, and then they're able to crush it and mix it with water. And it was used for la'atiach es habayis. In all these cases, he's trying to remove the hair, and we're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov in the way of morchin v'charsis b'adam v'sid. Why? Because that's called derech ma'abed. One of the 39 malachas is called ma'abed, is tanning, which is removing the hair from a hide. And they used to tan hides by removing the hair by using these kinds of charsis, adama, sid. So therefore, it looks to the onlooker when he does this on Yom Tov as if he's doing a malacha of ma'abed. However, if, on the other hand, he wants to soak the bird or the animal in hot water, that's not considered nira k'ma'abed. That's not the normal way you would prepare hides by removing the hair. He should not remove the hairs by shearing them off with a shearing knife or scissors, because once again, it looks like a malacha called gozes. Again, another malacha on the list of 39 is called gozes. Now the Beitza continues and addresses certain kinds of vegetables. And you want to prepare these vegetables for Achila on Yom Tov, ein gozes es hayerek b'tispore shelo. What happens is that when you have these yerukos that have many leaves, like for example, well, the first thing that comes to mind is cabbage. You could talk about lettuce and other kinds of vegetables. So if you notice, on the outside of the cabbage, very often the outer layer of the leaf is black or partially black, it's partially spoiled. So obviously you want to remove the Roshei HaOlim because they are spoiled. But you're not allowed to use a special kind of scissors that was designated for removing that which grows in the ground, right? You had those scissors, those very, very large scissors. You'll see the gardeners have them, and they use them to cut down vegetables that are growing in the garden. He wants to use it after they've already removed the yerek from the garden. All he's interested in doing is cutting out the rotten parts of the leaves that are on the outside. But if he's doing it by using that same scissors that is used by the professional gardeners to cut down vegetables that are growing in the ground, then already it looks too similar to meleches ktsira, to cutting something from the ground. Okay, these are two different types of vegetables, and they require quite a lot of hassle, a lot of work in order to prepare them. And in the Masechet doesn't tell you the names of these vegetables. Let's see if by chance in the English translation he has it. He calls it kundas and akbios. So he doesn't have a translation of these vegetables either. But all we know is that these are vegetables that require a great deal of tircha, a great deal of work in order to make them edible, to prepare them for eating. But nevertheless, that's the normal way you would do it. And it doesn't look like any sort of professional gardener or farmer or anything like that. And therefore, it's mutar on yont. Masikin v'ofen b'purne. Purne is a type of an oven. It's very, very large. It has an opening on the side, and it's a tircha rabbah because of the large nature of this oven. What's going to happen is that he's really doing a great amount of work to get the fire and heat up this large oven. But nevertheless, even though the purne requires such a great deal of tircha rabbah, it's mutter if, let's say, he needs a large oven. He doesn't have a small oven, or he has many guests that are coming, so he's baking a massive amount of bread. And also mechamim chamin. On Yontif, you're allowed to heat up water. Bi'antichi. An atiche is again a very large pot, or perhaps it's an oven, and he wants to heat up water in an oven or a large pot, because an antiche, what was the advantage in antiche? It's shomeres al chom hamayim lachar sichas l'meshet zman rab. It serves a double function because it also functions as a thermos and it maintains the heat for a long time. Now, somebody might say this should be asur because it looks like he's preparing hot water for tomorrow. He's putting it in this kind of a thermos, but the answer is no. He needs it today, and even though it's a very large amount, which maybe he doesn't need, but maybe guests will come, so he wants to prepare for guests. Ein ofen bepurne chadasha. However, we are not allowed to use this large oven for the very first time on Yom Tov. Shema tifachetz, because we're afraid that perhaps because of the massive, intense heat that it takes to heat up this gigantic oven, he might unfortunately break the oven from the heat. The heat itself will cause the oven to break, and then all the tircha and all the malach that he did with shalol tzarich yont. Rabbanan a nochin b'yantiv mapuach. You know what a mapuach is? Mapuach, when you want to get the fire going, you use a bellows. And that's a professional vessel. And we don't want to look like an uman, like a professional who's doing a malach. Aval nochin b'shfoferes. You have something that's a little bit more low key. It's not as sophisticated as a bellows, which is called shoferes. A shoferes is like a long reed that's has open space in it, right? It's open, and it's not used by the uman, and he wants to blow, the fire by using this shoferes. That he's allowed to do. Ein mesaknin es hashapud vein mechayv nosa. You have a brand new spit, and he wants to use it for afia or tzliya, more likely tzliya, then he's not allowed to prepare it on Yontif. Do it on Erev Yontif, but not on Yontif. Vein mechayv also means you're not allowed to sharpen it. Because again, in these cases, you're considered mitakin kli, and you're chayiv for makir v'patish. I have a note here that the Tana of this brisa would argue with Rabbi Yehuda because we have a Gemara back on Daf Chav Ches that records a machlok shin chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda with regard to machshirei ochal nefesh, and Rabbi Yehuda's matir machshirei ochal. And by preparing this shipud, he's involved in a malacha of machshirei ochal nefesh, according to Rabbi Yehuda's mutter. This brisa must be reflecting the sheet of the chachamim. However, it's possible that we're talking about a case of a shipud shenishbar rosho me'erev Yontif. On Erev Yontif, he realized that something broke in this shipud, the head of the shipud, and Rabbi Yehuda would also concede that you're not allowed to fix this up on Yontif because he could have done it on Erev Yontif. Rabbanon. Ein mefatzin es hakana litzlos bo moliach. You're not allowed to break a reed on Yontif in order to put small chatichos of the kana on a kli tzliya. They used to use, they didn't want to put food, let's say meat, directly on the fire. They needed some sort of a hefsek to separate the fire from the food, from the basar. So what they used was, they sometimes used chatichos hakana. They used to take small pieces of a reed, almost like a piece of wood, and they would put the fish or the meat on top of this kana. And by preparing it on Yontif, you violate tikkun mana, tikkun kli. You're creating a new utensil, which is a violation, as we said before, of makar v'patish. Aval, but what you're allowed to do on Yontif is mefatzin es ha'egos b'matlis. You can take a walnut and wrap it around with a matlis, which is a small cloth, and then what you do is you bang on the outside of the cloth and you crush the nuts. We're not afraid that as a result of this process, when the sharp shell of the walnut will now come in contact with the impact of his hitting the matlis will rip. And the question why we're not worried about this is a machlokas between Rabbi Akiva Eiger and others. Rabbi Akiva Eiger says that this writes or reflects the sheet of Rabbi Shimon of a davar she'eino miskaven. He has no intention to rip the matlis, and therefore it's mutter. However, others quote the Meiri, who seems to indicate that the reason why this is mutter is for an entirely different reason. not like Rabbi Kivega, who invokes the Shita Rabbi Shimon Dovich Miskanin, but rather halacha, which is codified in the Mishnah and Shabbos, like Kol HaMakalkalin P'tur. Because if he's going to rip the matlas, then he's makalkal. And this leads us to the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph.